Dr. Jose V. Pimienta. Round of applause, Dr. Bey. Dr. Jose V. Pimienta-Bey. One more time, a warm round of applause for Dr. Jose V. Pimienta-Bey.
I want to thank you all very much for coming out and giving me an opportunity to share what I hope is relevant and useful information. I, of course, begin by saying in my initial tradition, Islam, I also say Imhotep, and in the Arabic language, Assalamu alaikum. As I stood in the back listening to the brother talking about the situation that we face now and how the affairs, not only of this country, but the affairs of the world seem to be changing. And we have to essentially become more aware of what exactly is happening and where we should be going. I came in from West Virginia, and this past Saturday in West Virginia, there was a cross burning which had never taken place in Morgantown, West Virginia, as strange as it may sound. It's a little town with coal mines and a university. It had never taken place before. And this cross was burned on the lawn of an African-American couple who had never done anything to anybody in the quote-unquote white or European community. And all of a sudden, people were all upset, and they came together and said, you know, we need to do something about this. And then people found out that this family had been being harassed for years. The mayor of the town is African American. And she became mayor about 3 years ago, and the purpose behind it was essentially to try to heal these wounds which other people always knew about. But evidently, white supremacist groups have decided, and I'm using their term, white supremacist groups, have been infiltrating this area for years. And in fact, many of them are moving out of the Ku Klux Klan and into more violent organizations, smaller units. So as I took all this in and said, well, you know, here I am in Morgantown. I didn't expect, of course, to, avoid racism. I'd be a jackass if I thought I could avoid racism living in the United States. But I did understand that it wasn't so bad, but that things were changing. Well, I then go back to the history department, and I hear someone talking about a graduate student in the history department, fella, who was teaching some of his students that, to use his terms again, blacks, and this is interesting, Slavic peoples are inherently inferior because they are not Homo sapiens. Now, I started to ask myself, now, who does this sound like? If you know a little bit about the history of Germany, the rise of the Nazi Party and so forth, the Germans created this fallacious notion of racial supremacy, defining themselves as Aryans, when in fact the Aryans are Iranians, but they left that out. They're really talking about Nordic peoples, and they talked about the Germans. But they developed this to justify their going into the Slavic countries of Eastern Europe in order to take over. Now, I thought that was interesting, because usually, you know, people just kind of beat up on quote-unquote black folks. But this young man said Slavic peoples too. So I'm saying this is really getting interesting out here in terms of how the structure is changing. But then I also started to think to myself, I wonder how much this idiot knows about his own history. Because for me, my rationale for deciding to the Moorish legacy and Moorish history was because I always felt that the best way to silence most Europeans, so-called white folks, was to hit them in the bloodline. And what I mean by that is, if you begin to spend any time studying your own history, I'm speaking now to a European, spend any time studying your own Irish history, your own Scottish history, your own English history, your own Spanish history, your own Italian history, Calabria, anything in Europe, any culture in Europe can be traced to peoples outside of Europe. And one of the greatest influences, not only in blood, but in culture, in the sciences, one of the greatest influences are coming from people known by Europeans as the Moors. What I'd like to do now, if I can, is to get the slides. I brought some slides up, and I'll start in on the formal presentation. Some of my experiences, and even doing the research on the Moors. Coming down here, I was talking to the brother, I forget the brother's name, hopefully he'll forgive me. Well, actually, we were trying to find each other for about 45 minutes. But I was telling him that when you know essentially the legacy of the Moors, the legacy of African people, as it relates to European history, European culture, a lot of Europeans will back off. In fact, most Europeans who are educated will back off. They'll even concede, essentially, you know, who, like you know, we often say, you the man, you know, I can't say nothing to you because you woke up, obviously. Because you essentially, you know, telling them things that, well, now you're telling me more than I want to know. On the plane coming in, I sat next to this European fellow who was asking me what I did and so forth, and I told him, but then I started to continue to talk. And then I went on and on. He said, the Moors, I don't know too much about the, thank you, brother, too much about the Moors. Just that they were, they were Muslims, right? I said, well, yeah, well, you know, the vast majority of them were Muslims, but they were also people of other faiths. And he says, well, that's interesting. I said, but you know, the Moors are also in Ireland. And then he started to kind of move around in the seat, because he had also equated the Moors with Spain, and Spain only. So I said, no, actually, the Moors went up into Ireland and County Cork. In fact, I said, and there were even continued attacks on the coast by Moorish corsairs as late as the 16th century. And a lot of these people into those Irishmen living in Ireland. I said, and you know, when you look at names like Moore, which is pretty obvious, you see it. Or Scottish or Irish names that have the MC on the front, whether it's Mick or Mac. That's a reference to the Moors. So MacDougall and MacConnell and McMarion and MacMurray, etc. There's a reference to an African progenitor there. So the first slide I have up here is from Alfonso X, also known as El Sabio, or the Wise One. He was a Catholic monarch, 13th century, who after about 500 years of a Moorish presence, and let me just say who the Moors were. The Moors invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and let me be specific, the Islamic era Moors, because there were Moors before there was the religion called Islam. But the Islamic era Moors invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 711 of the Common Era. And they proceeded to transform the very nature of the environment. The Moors brought with them a postal system. The Moors brought with them an educational structure, which essentially is what the contemporary university is modeled after. The teaching of secular